Thank you very much. Good morning. Let me recognize my deputy governor, corporate services, on behalf of all other protocols. So thank you very much. I think this is highly intimidating, being the first to make a presentation in this highly, organized program. And the founder, thank you very much for the great job. For want of time, we're going to highlight some findings around this topic, navigating global shocks, monetary policy challenges for African central banks. And you're going to find details when the paper is uploaded. What we know concerning shocks at the moment is that shocks seem to have come to stay. Because while you are dealing with one, another one occurs. So it's no longer about whether shocks will occur or not. The question now is how to deal with it. And so for the past few, years, we have recorded multiple shocks with significant impact on world economies. And for that reason, we have seen that in Africa, these shocks affect all economies, but the impact is uneven. And it's significant in Africa because of the globalization and openness of economies, the high level of integration. And these shocks are determined by some structural factors. And so how to deal with it is important to understand how those shocks transmit. That will give us some understanding of how to respond to these shocks. So we're going to follow this outline, and I have mentioned these shocks. In terms of typology, the major shocks that have recently occurred, talks about the COVID-19 in 2020, the Russia-Ukraine war, which affects supply chain, and particularly, and most recently, the Middle East crisis. So, in a nutshell, this paper wants to analyze the significant transmission mechanism through which shocks affect economies and the response of monetary policy. And then we're going to look at how effective have been monetary policy responses in selected African economies. So in terms of theoretical underpinnings, we look at the Mundell-Fleming trilemma, that's the theory of the impossible trinity, which we all know. And in addition to that, there's even the fourth one, which now makes it the quadrilemma, of course, adding financial stability. These are the theoretical underpinnings for the work. Now, we look at major shocks which are global in nature and are transmitted to local economies. And first and foremost of them is the monetary and financial cycles, particularly in advanced economies like the US Fed. Meaning that when the Fed adjusts its policy, how does it affect, how does it transmit to economies in Africa? We also look at commodity price shock, which is key because of the commodity dependence nature of African economies. And in this case, we isolate crude oil prices, which is a major shock. And then we look at health and supply chain shocks. Recently, we have seen that health shock is no longer only a medical issue. It carries its own macroeconomic risk because of its impact on economy. Then the geopolitical risk shock, of course, which covers geopolitical tension and fragmentation and what have you. And then we also isolate the pass-through through exchange rate channel, which of course is the channel through which all these shocks transmit. So our paper looks at Nigeria and South Africa. And the reason for doing that is because two of these countries rank among the major economies of the world, and they have contrasting fundamentals, macroeconomic characteristics. For example, in South Africa, what we have in terms of monetary framework is formal inflation targeting. But in Nigeria, we are currently transiting. So you can see the variation. Then in exchange rate, we have just unified our rates about 3 years ago. South Africa has been floating. The rand has been floating for a while. In terms of depth of market, the market in South Africa is deeper than that of Nigeria. Then in terms of shock exposure, we are exposed more to oil shocks, oil price shocks, food imports, and currency shocks, unlike South Africa, whose major exposure is around global risk. So this talks about methodology. I've already mentioned those shocks for want of time. We engage the global VAR technique to isolate and trace shock transmission from the global level to domestic level. We also engage what we call the local projection model to now trace those shocks along levels of horizons, how they affect the economy. So these are the equations. Let's quickly look at the results. In terms of results, we first of all look at how does inflation respond to U.S. monetary policy, modification or propagation. What we have found here is, this is the case for Nigeria. This is the case, the second chart is the case for South Africa. What we have seen is that when there is a U.S. monetary policy shock, a positive shock for that matter, what you have found out is that there is a fall in inflation initially, so the initial impact is a fall in inflation. But after a while, you see inflation rising very sharply in few months, and then it gradually declines. Now, in South Africa, what we have seen is that there also is a decline. The first impact is a decline, meaning that that shock affects both economies initially with an impact. But the rate of increase, the quantum and the severity of increase in South Africa is much more moderate than how sharp it happens in Nigeria. And thereafter, it turns negative. What this means is that the inflationary effect of U.S. monetary policy tightening is not persistent in both economies. However, the impact and severity is sharper and higher in Nigeria. So we need to look at underlying structural issues that, determine what this has been in the two economies. Then we look at exchange rates. And don't forget, exchange rates is crucial here because all these shocks we have mentioned transmit from the global level to domestic economies through this channel, the channel of exchange rate. What the numbers suggest to us is that in Nigeria, which is the first chart here, the impact record an immediate and larger depreciation in the local currency than what we saw in South Africa. The impact is much smaller initially. So the level of depreciation here is much higher. But there is a quick correction thereafter, and you see the impact stabilizing after a while. And again, what it means here is that we look at the fundamentals in terms of market debt through which this impact transmits. And then you will see that if you have a bigger market, you have a bigger, reserve level, you have a stronger, base and buffers, then it determines how far you'll be able to respond to those shocks and absorb those shocks in terms of exchange rate. So this looks at the forecast error variance decomposition. And what we have seen here in terms of inflation and contribution to inflation, those components, shows that if you look at Nigeria, the data is showing that own shock accounts for 71.37%. And this is referring to inflation inertia. So the level of policy credibility and how much the economy and the people are able to, get used to expectation, in terms of policy credibility. This is huge because, again, that has to do with how much the economy and the people and businesses are able to trust your policy over time. In South Africa, own shock accounts for 76.6%. So this is a very key consideration that we need to look at. If you look at policy rates own shock account for 63.67%, while in South Africa, it accounts for 76.07%. If you compare the policy rate and inflation and exchange rate, it gives us an idea that focusing more on policy to respond to some of these shocks without looking at structural issues that will improve on policy credibility may be a wrong, response. So it's important here to consider both not just the policy rate as a response to this shock, but also policy credibility. I'm running out of time, so this is exactly what we have found, but I want to quickly give us what this means. The implication of this findings, number one, is the fact that we should treat monetary surveillance very importantly, meaning that we need to look at how these shocks emerge. Number two, we also need to treat exchange rate as a central factor, not secondary. We need to treat rate policy and complement it with structural reforms, as is going on in Nigeria now. And finally, we need to know that monetary policy framework alone is not enough. It depends on how much you are able to, supplement it with reforms. That is the only way to be able to respond positively and adequately to reforms and to shocks from the external sector. I want to stop here and thank you for listening.